Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on history of English literature and so far we have conducted 14 sessions under this series. Today is the 15th lecture and today we would be talking on romantic prose. In the first half we would be discussing on the colouring of imagination. In the second half we would be discussing on Hazlitt, Lamb and De Quincey, and for this we have once again with us Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya. Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya is a renowned academician who is appreciated by the students in India and abroad. He has been formerly Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University. He has authored a book called A New History of English Literature. Dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and let's try to understand more and more about the romantic prose. So, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Well, in this lecture, we will be talking about the romantic prose. One thing which is basic about the romantic prose is the same as about romantic literature in general. That is, that it is emotive, it is individual, it is intuitive, it is imaginative. All these factors mark a sharp difference from the classical or neoclassical prose, poetry or writing in general. There we saw it was socially bound, it was politically bound, it was determined by rules. There were rules laid down for every game. It may be a poem, it may be a prose, it may be novel, criticism. You couldn't transgress the rules. So within the bounds of rules, you had to move. Here in the Romantic age, there is total individuality. Each individual has her or his freedom to respond to the poem or to any literary writing in his own best understanding. So there is this element of individuality. No two poets, no two prose writers, no two critics in this age are alike. They may be similar, but they are not alike because they follow their own instincts, they follow their own philosophies, they follow their own understanding of what literature is. So that is one basic thing about romantic prose. Now, so far as the major practitioners of romantic prose are concerned, there were very many. Almost every writer worth the name during these years wrote one thing or another, and all very important in their own respective ways. So it is hard to make really a choice, and yet you can't help it. A choice has to be made because you have limited time and you have to focus on what you think are the major pieces of prose during this period. Well, one of the names that comes to mind is Charles Lamb. One good thing about Charles Lamb is that he didn't publish anything under his own name alone. It was always Mary and Charles Lamb. Mary was his sister. So they published together, they wrote together they always would divide the work between themselves and do it. So there are similarities of style between the two, their intents and purposes being the same, their interests being the same. So there are very many similarities between the two of them, brother and sister, and they are always mentioned together, Mary and Charles Lamb. Their years are 1775 born and 1834 death. So between these years, we had brother and sister writing. Their famous title of essays is the Essays of Elia, E-L-I-A, 1823, which were originally contributed to a London magazine. Later they were published as a separate book. So they are very important and very popular also. Wherever you have a course in English prose, you will always have the essays of Elia prescribed. In these essays, there are two characters like Mary and Charles Lamb. You have here Bridget and James Elia. These are the two characters who are in a way pseudonyms for Mary and John Lamb. John Lamb was the brother of Charles Lamb. So they are made the characters in these prose pieces. So pseudonyms are used as Bridget and James Elia. Bridget Elia and James Elia. Most memorable of the essays, because there are very many, but some are very popular. They are generally prescribed in BA honors or MA syllabi, and they are liked by most readers. One of the famous essays that Charles Lamb wrote is Christ's Hospital 5 and 30 years ago. Christ's Hospital 5 and 30 years ago. It is actually not about the hospital. This was a charity school run by the Christ's Hospital. And it was in this charity school that those who could not afford the education of the public schools, like Herod, where sons and daughters of the lords, rich people, they will study. So ordinary citizens, they will be studying in these charity schools. So Charles Lamb, Mary Lamb, Coleridge, these people who turned out to be great writers, they studied in these ordinary schools. So what Charles Lamb does is he recalls his days at the school, how they studied there, what kind of climate, atmosphere, and what kind of fellow students he had, and the overall atmosphere, and how they grew up in that environment of the Christ Hospital charity school. Because both Coleridge and Lamb, they came from poor families. So obviously they couldn't think of public schools. So they studied here. So this is one of the important essays, very popular one, Christ's Hospital 5 and 30 years ago. Then another equally popular and in fact even more so is The Two Races of Man. It's a shorter essay, very humorous. You would like it. Here Lamb says there are only two races of man. One is the lender, the other is the borrower. Some people lend money, some people borrow money. So he says these are the only two classes or races of man. The point is trying to make is he brings in his friend S.T. Coleridge, and he says S.T. Coleridge belongs to the race of borrowers. He says he used to borrow books from everybody, from all his friends, because he couldn't afford to buy himself. He would borrow books. But he says he would borrow and borrow and borrow, but never return. So that's a humorous piece showing through humor the chief quality of his friend S.T. Coleridge, that he was a voracious reader, that he was too much given to reading books. No wonder that he turned out to be a philosophic poet, a philosophic prose writer, and his famous Biographia Literaria, which is a compendium of biographical material, philosophic material, then reminiscences, memories, portraits of friends. So several things mixed together. We call it compendium. But then that was the manner of the Romantic prose writing. All of them were doing that, mixing up different genres, because they were not hung up like the neoclassicals with any sort of rules of construction, forms, shapes. No. The difference between the Romantic writing, it may be a poem, it may be a prose piece, and the neoclassical is that where the forms in neoclassical literature are already decided, predetermined, they are ready made, available, just like a bottle or a box, whether it is square or round. So all is already available. It's a matter of choice for you, which one you want to pick up and write accordingly. So everything will be measured, the total shape, every individual line, rhyming scheme, etc., etc. But in the Romantic writing, there are no such outside rules governing you. All that governs is within you. So it is your own individual self, your own genius, your own intuition, which determines the kind of writing you do. So it is entirely internal, it is entirely individual, it is entirely intuitive, it is entirely emotional, it is entirely imaginative. It is this kind of prose. So you have these pieces by Charles and Mary Lamb recalling their own personal life at the school or elsewhere, and portraits of their friends like S.T. Coleridge's. And humor, of course, is again individual. It's not the kind of humor you have in the neoclassical, which is the same everywhere. You may read one writer and you may read 10 writers. it will be formula kind of humor, so no change, no difference, no individuality. Here it will be typical of every writer. So Charles Lamb had a humor of his own, and in this Two Races of Men, he portrays the life of S.T. Coleridge, his own friend, and humorously he tells us how voracious a reader he was, but since he couldn't afford himself to buy all those books, he would rather borrow. But one wrong habit was he will never return those books. So it is that kind of essay by Charles Lamb. And then there are other things besides Christ's Hospital 5 and 30 years ago and the Two Races of Men. Another is Mrs. Battle's opinions on whist, which again is very humorous. Mrs. Battle's character, the kind of funny things and the kind of obstinate opinions that she had, and nobody on earth could make her change those opinions. It is that kind of character. And then we have Dream Children, a Reverie, a very different kind of essay. So you have that variety, individuality in the romantic prose, romantic essay. It's not only imaginative, it is beyond imagination also. You have reverie here, you have a dream, and you are imagining something which doesn't exist around you. Here on this earth, in this life, you are imagining a life beyond this. So that is what Charles Lamb does in Dream Children. And then in Praise of Chimney Sweepers, another very interesting essay. So this is another side to the romantic literature. Besides its being individualistic, being imaginative, it was also socially inclined towards the lower sections of society. In the neoclassical age, the bias was the upper classes, feudal. So the mind set, the mind makeup of the neoclassical writers was feudalistic. They were committed to feudal ideology and those very values, and they will write in praise of those big people and their way of life, and they will make fun of the lower classes, the servant class and so on. Here it is the other way around. The romantic writer has basic sympathy for the lower classes. So Chimney Sweepers, imagine, or Dream Children, you have Charles Lamb portraying a very sympathetic picture of the chimney sweepers and drawing your pity, your compassion for them. That look at these poor boys, the way they have to work hard and work for hours together, and a dirty kind of work. They are covered with black soot, so they have to live in those conditions. So this also is a strong side of the romantics, that as against the feudal mindset of the neoclassical, the courtly kind of poets and prose writers, here you have who are more socially committed to the lower sections, to the lower strata of society. And the chimney sweepers is an evidence to that. Another interesting piece is a dissertation upon roasting pig. You see, the meat eaters, they have roasted meat. There are a variety of meat the eaters of it prefer. This is one of the varieties, a roasted pig. And very humorously and in great detail, on the face of it, very seriously and very technically, Lamb describes how a pig is roasted to make it delicious for eating, and so on, and at what point you should stop the roasting, etc., etc., quantity, this, that, all those details. So, this is another aspect of Romantic writing, its variety, its individuality is not bound by any publicly accepted norm. In the neoclassical age, you could not write about anything and everything. You will have to pick up a subject which is socially acceptable, which does not offend the sensibility of the ruling classes. So they should not take it beneath their dignity even to see it or to hear about it. But here in the Romantic age, there is a total freedom. You could say any funny thing and about anyone. So here you have Charles Lamb writing about a dissertation upon roasting pig. Now there is another set of things or set of pieces that Charles and Mary Lamb wrote, which has been in fact more popular. That is, Tales from Shakespeare. Wonderful summaries, prose summaries of the plays of Shakespeare. So easier to understand, because Shakespeare's plays in their original Elizabethan language cannot really be understood by the common reader. You have to be an expert. You have to know the Elizabethan English, its nuances, dramatic practices, technique, etc., etc., before you can appreciate Shakespeare as a dramatist. So, to make it popular and to make it easier for the common man, they wrote summaries, short summaries of each play. So, one summary, one play, so that it is available in prose and available just like a short story. So, this is what Charles and Mary Lamb did, Tales from Shakespeare. I have read them and they are really very good. One wouldn't go to the original pieces after reading them, because they are so neatly done and so briefly done. Who would like to read that arduous 3-hour long play? Here within minutes you can grasp and you can comprehend the essence of the play. So, Tales from Shakespeare was another book that Charles and Mary Lamb wrote, and that too became very popular. So, both were popular writers and very likable. Well, thank you for the time being. In this lecture, we are going to carry the story of Romantic prose further. We were talking about Charles and Mary Lamb, and that took very long. There are several more writers left, so let's try to touch upon all of them, at least briefly, because they are equally important. They are no less than Charles Lamb. So, one of these writers was William Hazlitt. William Hazlitt, in fact, had greater prestige because Hazlitt was a critic. Hazlitt was writing a magazine, was bringing out his own publications. So, one of the important books that he wrote was The Spirit of the Age or Contemporary Portraits. This came out in 1825. The Spirit of the Age or the Contemporary Portraits. Now, from the title itself, you can see, and the title is very important because for the first time, he made us aware that every age is dominated by some one thing. Call it the spirit, call it the driving force, call it the dominant concern of the age, and which is very true. If the new classical were driven by the social concerns of their time, the romantics are driven by their individual intuitions and emotions and imaginations. So, that is the difference. And Hazlitt, being a critical mind and a leading one at that, he tries to make out a case for the romantic age, that like any other age, it has a spirit of its own. It has a driving force of its own, and therefore, largely or in lesser measure, all writers are moving towards the same goal and on the same path. They may not be doing precisely the same thing, but they are doing something or things very similar. They are not very dissimilar, not poles apart from each other. So, that is what the spirit of the age means. And there, of course, he gives us contemporary portraits of many of his colleagues. Then there are other essays that he wrote on going on a journey, This has been very popular. The pleasures of a morning walk, for example. Then on the fear of death, of course, everybody experiences it, and nobody wants to have that day. You'd like to put it off. That is human tendency. You have the fear, you don't want to die. Although in King Lear there is something sensible. There Edgar says, man must accept his going hence, even as his coming hither ripeness is all. Well, if you have no objection to your being born, why do you have objection to your going from here? So that is the wisdom from King Lear. And a natural kind of instinct he describes here, the fear of death. On reading old books, another popular essay, on persons one would wish to have seen. Then my first acquaintance with poets. Then on the feeling of immortality in youth, because youth has that misgiving, because youth is not aware of death, and youth has that illusion that life is forever, you are not going to die. So on the feeling of immortality in youth, and on disagreeable people. So there is a variety. On disagreeable people, people you would not like to know, people you would not like to befriend, you would not like to sit with them or talk to them. So there are all kinds. He had written another piece, you remember in the beginning, people you wish to know, people you would like to talk to and make friends with. So here it is the opposite. So this kind of variety, based on your moods, your feelings, your reveries, your dreams, it is this internal, inner stuff that romantic writing is about. The neoclassical writing was about what is external, what is public. Here, what is private. That is a big difference between two kinds of writing. Well, that brings us to another writer. After Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt, we have Thomas De Quincey. By the way, Hazlitt is better known as a literary critic. He wrote on the characters of Shakespeare's plays, and which is an important piece. And he highlights the importance of each character in the play. So that brings us to another very interesting writer, Thomas De Quincey. Thomas De Quincey. And the famous book he wrote was Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Very funny book. Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Those days, there was this addiction among some of these writers. De Quincey, Coleridge, they were given to eating opium, not by choice. To begin with, this was a medicine suggested to them, because there was no other pain reliever those days. These days you have lot of tablets, all kinds you can have, painkillers. Those days there was nothing. So the only way to get over the intense feeling of pain was opium. So, opium will desensitize your body and therefore will make it tolerable. So, both Coleridge and De Quincey, they used to eat that, but then De Quincey made the best use of it. He wrote this very interesting and one of the funniest books, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, where he reveals his experiences of how after eating opium he had all sorts of funny experiences, and those experiences are described in this book. This was in 1821, and many years after, in 1849, he also wrote another very interesting book, The English Mail Coach. This was quite a phenomenon of the time, the English mail coach, because there was no other way to distribute letters, but letters must reach everybody's home. So, they had hired a coach at the postal department, and it was this coach which would go from home to home and deliver the letters. So, De Quincey wrote an interesting piece about it, The English Mail Coach, which was published in 1849. Another writer of the time, you can see the kind of variety that you have. You will not find it in the neoclassical prose. There you read one and read all, they will be similar. Maybe Dryden, Pope, Johnson, and so on, Addison, Steele, all are similar and similar attitudes. Here each one is different. Another is Walter Savage Landor. Walter Savage, S-A-V-A-G-E, very strange name, Landor, L-A-N-D-O-R, 1775-1864. Well, he wrote another interesting book that was Imaginary Conversations. So you can see the variety in the Romantic prose, and imaginative, innovative, each one coming out with something altogether new, something one would look for and would feel like experiencing it. So that is what Landor did, imaginary conversations. Well, there are 52 imaginary conversations, not one, and it took a long time to complete them. Between 1824 and 1853, 29 years. So it took 29 years, and if you include the beginning year, 30 years. So in these 30 years, he completed 52 conversations. And who are these characters involved in conversations? You have there mythical characters, literary figures from famous writers like Petrarch. You have that lover and his girl talking to each other, Romeo and Juliet, for example. You can have that, etc., etc. So he picks up characters, interesting, familiar, mythical, legendary, popular, pairs of characters, mostly lovers, and then he creates imaginary conversations, how they must have talked to each other. So brought out interesting pieces, imagined situations, imagined characters, imagined talks. That's what Lender did. For example, there is one between Dante and Beatrice. So Dante had written so many sonnets for Beatrice, that girl he loved, and all those sonnets are addressed to her. So what Lender does is bring them as characters and involve them in conversation, makes it funny. That is the romantic side to it, making it humorous. Similarly, you have Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, famous love affair between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Although Henry VIII has a terrible record of getting all the four of his wives killed. He'll marry them, get them killed, marry another, get her killed. He was always in love with the next woman, and the present one he will get eliminated. So Anne Boleyn at one time, he was crazy about her. He wanted to marry, he married her. She was, by the way, the mother of Queen Elizabeth. And later he got her killed. And if you know, Walter Scott wrote a novel about it, Ivanhoe, Kenilworth. And that novel is based upon this story. It came about that in the museum somewhere, he found a piece of writing, a confessional letter by the Lord. One of the lords who had been assigned the job by Henry VIII to push Anne Boleyn round the stairs, down the stairs. And this lord did it and killed Anne Boleyn. But later his conscience pricked. He felt very bad about it, that he is a murderer. He had killed a woman against whom he had nothing personal. So he wrote that confessional letter, which is still available in the British Museum. And this became the basis for this dialogue. So Lender did these things. Similarly, another interesting one is Pericles and Aspasia. Pericles, you know, one of the kings. You have Shakespeare's play also, Pericles, at the end. And then to begin with, originally, the Greek play, Pericles. So in ancient times, Pericles was the king of Athens. Athens was the capital of Greece at that time, and it was imperial state. So they ruled entire Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on. Later, the Romans did. So it deals with that. So similar kind of pieces. That brings us to S.T. Coleridge. S.T. Coleridge also wrote a prose book, a very famous one. He wrote, of course, several. Aid to Reflection, for example, which became the basis for the American Romanticism, Transcendentalism. But then the book we are talking about is by S.T. Coleridge, Biographia Literaria, 1817. Biographia Literaria is essentially an autobiography. He is writing about himself, his own experiences, and what he came across in life, the kind of people, kind of events, kind of things. So, all that becomes a part of Biographia Literaria. But then, even within this kind of compendium, this kind of biographical writing, we have Coleridge doing literary criticism, theory. For example, he defines what is fancy and what is imagination. So, to make out this subtle distinction between fancy and imagination, no other writer had done, no other critic had done. And he shows how imagination is a higher faculty and fancy is a lower faculty of the mind. Just like reason and understanding, fancy can also do the work of putting things together, dividing them, and bring about an understanding through these methods, which are as old as Aristotle. You know, from there we had this methodology of understanding by dividing, by combining, etc., etc. So, this is what fancy does. Coleridge says this is the lower level of the mind's faculty, which is called fancy. But imagination, he says, does something higher, in fact, highest. It can not only combine things, but after combining them, it can recreate something altogether new and something higher, something superior. So, that is what imagination is. So, he thinks this is the highest faculty of the mind. Lower down the scale, you have several others, including reason, understanding, fancy, etc., etc. But imagination, he says, comes at the top, and that is the highest, most creative faculty human mind is blessed with. So, S.T. Coleridge does that in his famous book Biographia Literaria, again came out in 1817. So, these are some of the important prose books that you have during the Romantic age. Of course, prose should also include the novel, the short story. But then the novel and the short story were not so popular during the Romantic age as this Romantic prose was. Just like Romantic poetry, this had the strain of individualism, strain of something private, something personal, something emotional, something intuitive, something imaginative. So, these many qualities were not available in any other kind of writing. So, that's why Romantic prose became the leading writing of the age, besides, of course, Romantic poetry. Romantic poetry remains still the leading one, but next to Romantic poetry was Romantic prose, not even Romantic novel, although in its own right, Romantic novel too was important, because it was a very different kind of novel, and this too is prose, it is prose fiction. but then not so much of fiction as biography, as something personal. And that's why you have writers like Walter Scott, Maria Edgeworth, and they came out with a new genre altogether. Because in the 18th century, neoclassical age, if you remember, the novel was socio-political, largely social, based upon morals and manners that were acceptable to the society, that were formally approved by the society. So within that framework of the social approval, you had to write the prose. So they had that prose both in the form of novel and essay. But here it is a very different. It is more individualistic, it is more intuitive, emotional, imaginative, and nothing to do with socially accepted norms, etc. So that is what you have here. Jane Austen, Maria Edgeworth, Walter Scott, Mary Shelley. There were so many writers of the novel. So one new kind of novel form, as I said, that came out during this period was the historical novel. Walter Scott, in fact, became famous on that count, historical novel, and he wrote a long series covering the entire history of Scotland. So fiction plus history combined, that would constitute the historical novel. His novels were called Waverley novels, Waverley. And under that title, he wrote several, more than a dozen. Kenilworth was one of them, Ivanhoe and other, so on and so forth. Very interesting novels. They are read and prescribed for students also, like at the MA level, even at the honors. So even more important, more popular, The Heart of Midlothian, historical novel. The Heart of Midlothian, which came out in 1818, and Kenilworth 1821, Ivanhoe 1819. So these are historical novels and all called Waverley. But Maria Edgeworth wrote two famous novels, Castle Rackrent, 1800, and Belinda, more familiar name, Belinda, Balinda, 1801. So these two novels by Maria Edgeworth. Another you need to remember is Mary Shelley. You must be already familiar with Mary Shelley. She wrote those two very important novels. One is Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus, 1818. Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus, which is the subtitle. So Frankenstein is a self-destructive scientist, the kind of thing we are doing now. The scientists are producing men-like figures, and they can destroy themselves as well as others. So it was a futuristic book in a way. It tells what was about to come. So we have Frankenstein, and the other one was The Last Man, where again futuristic, and Mary Shelley says that 2973 the world will end itself. Mankind will destroy itself. I think, thank you for the day. That is the story about romantic prose, including fiction. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very vivacious session. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that we would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on another topic under the series, History of English Literature. Till then, keep watching us, keep watching our further sessions. We would be meeting again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.